Hello YouTube. We are continuing our look at terraforming. A fourth argument against terraforming is given by Keecock Lee in her article Awe and Humility, Intrinsic Value in Nature. Lee's strategy is to consider the sense in which natural items on Earth have intrinsic value, and then she tries to extend this account to other planets. According to Lee, respectful behaviour towards the natural environments of Earth follows from three theses. First, the no-teleology thesis. This is a claim that the natural world exists for itself and not for humans. Although humans can certainly make use of the natural world, it wasn't built to serve us. We just happen to appear on the scene like any other animal. Humans are one part of a much larger web of living and non-living processes, and all of these other things exist for their own sake, not for us. Related to this is the autonomy thesis, which says that the natural world is fully autonomous from humans. This is simply the point that nature exists and can function perfectly well without us. If we disappeared tomorrow, the Earth would not be adversely affected. Indeed, if anything, it would probably improve. It would have a chance to recover from the extreme degradation to the environment that we've caused. Finally, the asymmetry thesis states that while nature is autonomous from humans, humans are wholly dependent on nature. We need the biosphere to function properly. We need abiotic processes such as energy from the sun. If these things were disrupted, we would all die. So there's an asymmetry of dependence. We are wholly dependent on nature. Nature is not dependent on us. According to Lee, the proper response to nature, given no teleology, autonomy and asymmetry, is awe, by which she means reverential fear and wonder, and humility. There are things about humans that are special, such as our superior cognitive abilities, but every species has particular characteristics that make it unique. In the space of nature, humans have no privileged position. We should approach nature with a fear and wonder of its power, and also a humility, recognising our dependence on it. Now, next, Lee suggests that this proper response of awe and humility involves keeping a respectful distance from nature, which is vague, to say the least. But I guess the intuition here is that if we engage in massive projects of transforming nature, this sort of presumes that we're superior to it, that it's ours to do with as we will. We should instead try to live in harmony with the environments that we encounter. Don't make excessive demands of them, don't damage their integrity, don't try to radically change them, just respect them as they are. So, that's Lee's account of what makes nature valuable on Earth. Finally, Lee argues that these three theses apply equally to Mars. Mars exists for itself, not for humans, which satisfies no teleology. The various processes on Mars are fully autonomous of humans. After all, humans never even knew about Mars until relatively recently, in terms of cosmic and geological time, so that clearly satisfies autonomy. However, we are dependent on Mars for our survival. If you removed Mars from the solar system, this would change the orbit of Earth, moving it closer to the Sun, where arguably life would not be able to survive. So Mars demands a response of awe and humility, and this requires keeping a respectful distance from it. From this point of view then, the problem with terraforming should be obvious. Terraforming would be a project of environmental transformation unlike any we've ever done before. It would radically alter the entire Martian environment. That's not keeping a respectful distance from it. That wouldn't be respecting the integrity of the Martian environment as it currently exists. Presumably, Lee would not object to people building bases on Mars because they wouldn't have so much of they wouldn't have an impact on the environment as a whole. But terraforming, as I think we pointed out in the last video, terraforming is totalizing. It would transform everything. So that would probably violate this requirement of keeping a respectful distance. I think there are many problems with this argument. First of all, the no teleology thesis is very questionable. Does it make sense to speak of nature existing for itself? It's certainly true that nature doesn't exist for us, but it doesn't follow that it exists for itself. I would say that the natural world doesn't exist for anything. It doesn't exist for humans, for animals, for gods, nor does it exist for itself, whatever that would mean. It just exists. That's all. I mean, pick any natural item you like, a fungus, a plant, a mountain, a salt marsh, a forest. These things just exist. They don't exist for anything. I mean, perhaps this doesn't really matter. Maybe Lee's argument would work just as well if we say that the natural world doesn't exist for humans specifically. But there is an important difference here. Saying that the natural world doesn't exist for humans isn't the same as saying that it exists for itself. And I think that the no teleology thesis, as Lee states it, is simply wrong. It's just wrong. More seriously, we can question the autonomy thesis. Is the natural world autonomous from humans? I think there are several senses in which it clearly isn't. First, many parts of the natural world can't function perfectly well without us. There are species that are nearing extinction, such as the black rhino, panda, Hawaiian crow, the European water vole, and arguably it requires active intervention on the part of humans to save these species. I mean, to a certain extent, this is just making up for past wrongs. Most cases of species extinctions in the modern world are our fault. But evidently, if we want to say that we have a responsibility to protect these species, the autonomy thesis is actively counterproductive, because it suggests that intrinsic value is limited to those things that can exist without human intervention. And there are many species where we will actively have to work to save them. Another sense in which nature is arguably not autonomous from us is that humans have been integrated with the biosphere for so long and have had such a profound effect on it that it isn't really true that the biosphere as a whole could function without humans, at least as it currently exists. If humans disappeared tomorrow, Earth's biosphere, as it currently exists, would radically change. There are 7 billion humans on the planet. There are billions of animals we keep on farms. We've totally transformed huge areas of the world's surface. So if you take something that appears to be completely wild, for instance, the flight patterns of a group of wild ravens on an uninhabited island, well, even this isn't fully autonomous from humans. It's very likely that if we disappeared, the changes globally would be so profound that even this apparently completely wild group of ravens would be affected. So it's very unclear in what sense we can say that that the biosphere is fully autonomous. If we took humans out of the picture, it would change. So it doesn't seem that as it is at the moment, it is fully autonomous. It seems that it does depend on us. Finally, humans could play an active role in protecting the biosphere from threats like asteroid impact. I'm not sure whether we really have the technology for this at the moment, but if we had the technology to terraform, we'd surely have the technology to fling a dangerous asteroid off course. And the same is true of Mars. We can imagine a giant asteroid threatening important areas of Mars. We'd be able to intercept and move it off course. We would be protecting Mars, in which case the Martian environment as it is would not be autonomous from us. So I think the autonomy thesis is very questionable. And obviously in threatening the autonomy thesis, these points also threaten the asymmetry thesis. If nature is dependent on humans, then there isn't this asymmetry of humans being dependent on nature while nature is autonomous of humans. I mean, I guess Lee could respond to these points that, these are maybe a bit pedantic. Nature is autonomous assuming normal circumstances. I guess there's some difficulty specifying exactly what normal circumstances are, but you can probably see the intuitive point here. The biosphere was around and was functioning perfectly well long before humans arrived, barring totally freak occurrences like some massive asteroid impact. It will function perfectly well after we disappear. The kinds of general processes that keep the biosphere functioning are independent of us, even if the biosphere in its present form depends on us in various ways. Perhaps nature isn't fully autonomous, but it is largely autonomous, and clearly we need nature much more than it needs us. So, to be fair, I think the autonomy and asymmetry theses clearly have some truth to them. even if they need to be qualified a little. There is, however, another problem with the asymmetry thesis. Is it actually true that we're dependent on Mars? Mars does have an effect on us. If Mars disappeared, our orbit would change, but how much would it change? I'm not sure it would be that significant. Mars doesn't make a big contribution to the mass of the solar system. It's just a speck compared to the gas giants, for instance. If we lost Jupiter, that would be bad. If we lost Mars, I'm not sure much would change. I did actually look this up, but I spent about 5 minutes reading and I couldn't find a conclusive answer. So I don't know if it's true that if Mars disappeared, life on Earth would die, humans would die. In any case, this is maybe beside the point. Let's grant that we're dependent on Mars in this way and that without Mars the Earth would fall out of the habitable zone. Well, this is to say that we're dependent on Mars's gravity, but we're in no way whatsoever dependent on the atmospheric, geological, chemical conditions of Mars. You could replace Mars with a completely different planet of the same mass, and that wouldn't have any effect whatsoever on our survival. So it seems to me that asymmetry provides no reason at all not to terraform. Mars's present climate is in no way dependent on us, and we are in no way dependent on it. There is no asymmetry in the respect that's relevant to terraforming. Perhaps the biggest problem with Lee's argument is that it's not clear why terraforming would necessarily violate the requirement of awe and humility. Lee says that awe and humility involve keeping a respectful distance from nature, and of course terraforming would be an extremely radical change. But you certainly can't rule out all radical changes to nature as being morally wrong, not unless you want to return to a hunter-gatherer existence. Humans are going to change natural things in big ways. I think the trouble is that awe and humility relate specifically to our attitudes, not so much to our actual actions. So surely, the most that appealing to awe and humility can do is place constraints on how we approach terraforming, on the sort of attitude we take towards terraforming. If we should approach Mars with awe and humility, we shouldn't assume that we're superior to Mars, or that Mars is merely ours to do whatever we want with. But why would awe and humility rule out terraforming Mars? I mean, this is pretty much the same problem we raised for Sparrow's argument. Lee's argument rests on the idea that terraforming is wrong because it evinces a vicious attitude. But the basic problem with this is that there are many motivations we might have for terraforming, many attitudes we might take towards it. If Lee wants to claim that every motivation for terraforming would involve disrespecting Mars or would preclude treating Mars with awe and humility, we would need a separate argument for that. And Lee doesn't give any such argument. I also think it's worth noting, and this isn't so much a criticism, just an interesting point, I'm not sure how well this idea of keeping a respectful distance from nature would go down among most environmentalists. Most environmentalists, in my experience, seem to think that we should try to be closer to nature, more connected with nature. Indeed, I suspect that many environmentalists would suggest that our distance from nature is precisely the problem. So there may be a difficulty with this notion of keeping a respectful distance. Anyway, those were some arguments against terraforming. Of course, any arguments against terraforming, even if you accept them, would need to be weighed against those in favour of it. Even if you accept every argument we've looked at, they wouldn't entail a duty not to terraform if there were exceptionally good reasons for terraforming. In which case, let's turn to some positive arguments from a deep green perspective. First, a preliminary point. Environmentalists tend to be very concerned with environmental preservation, not interfering, keeping the environment in its current state. Practically speaking, this is a very useful goal on Earth, where there are barely any places left that humans haven't interfered with, and where our interference has been almost uniformly negative, at least from an environmental perspective. So environmentalists tend to adopt this working assumption that nature knows best. Leave the natural world in the state you found it. Don't interfere. But it's important not to assume that everything nature does is equally valuable. The value of the non-living or abiotic environment is in general weaker than the value of ecosystems, biospheres. I'm pretty happy to say that a planet with rich and diverse life is significantly more valuable than a planet without life. Perhaps a planet with potential to support life is more valuable than one without any such potential. And furthermore, given this point, environmentalists shouldn't assume that any natural change to life conditions is as good as any other natural change. We can say that past extinction events, for instance, were bad, even if they were caused entirely naturally by asteroid impact or natural climate change. With this point in mind, we can consider some environmentalist defences of terraforming. The first argument, which I'm calling the protection of life argument, rests on the point that the destruction of life, when it comes, will be a very bad thing. Life on this planet isn't going to last forever. In about 5 billion years, the sun as we know it will die, its core will be exhausted, and the subgiant phase will begin. Life won't be around to see this. Over the lifetime of the sun, there's been a steady increase in solar luminosity, and this will continue into the future. It's getting hotter. This means that the habitable zone, the zone in which a planet can sustain liquid water, further out water would freeze and closer water would evaporate. The habitable zone is gradually moving outwards. Eventually, the habitable zone will push out beyond the Earth. This planet will become too hot for life. This will happen in about 1.6 billion years. Assuming that life remains on this planet, we're already more than halfway through its run. Life emerged about 3.7 billion years ago. It has another 1.6 billion years to go. But actually the news gets a bit more depressing. In only 600 million years, the increased solar luminosity will disrupt the carbon silicate cycle, and levels of carbon dioxide will fall to the point that most plant species will be unable to maintain photosynthesis. Almost all animals will die out with them. In 800 million years, all multicellular life will be extinct. So in terms of geological time, life as we know it doesn't have much longer left. I doubt that humans need to worry about this. We won't be around in 600 million years. But obviously, if we take a deep green perspective, we extend our concern beyond humans. Mars is much further out from the Sun. It will remain in the habitable zone for at least a couple billion years longer than the Earth. So this provides an obvious motivation for terraforming. It will allow us to substantially extend the time of life. It will allow life to exist for much longer than it otherwise would do, avoiding the final and greatest extinction event, something that I'm sure any deep green environmentalist will be a bad thing when it happens. We could avoid that for at least another couple billion years. Unfortunately, there's a fairly serious problem with this argument. As Christopher McKay points out in his article Planetary Ecosynthesis on Mars, the likelihood is that such a terraformed environment would rapidly degrade, relatively rapidly, geological time. Mars had habitable conditions in the past, but these deteriorated. The trouble is that Mars is small. It's visibly smaller than Earth, and it has only 1/10 the mass of Earth. Now, Earth is large enough and heavy enough that it has an internal heat flow, which drives plate tectonics, and this means it frequently recycles its material as volcanoes eject gases back into the atmosphere. Furthermore, Earth has a strong magnetic field which protects its atmosphere from solar wind. Mars has no plate tectonics, it has a single thick plate, hence it has not nearly as much volcanism. Indeed, it possibly has no active volcanoes whatsoever. Its atmosphere never gets replenished. And worse, its magnetic field is extremely weak, so the solar wind interacts directly with its atmosphere, stripping it away. McKay calculates that if we terraformed Mars, it would remain habitable for only 10 to 100 million years. That's pretty short in terms of geological time. And as you can see, it's much shorter than life has left on this planet in any case. So, perhaps the defender of the protection of life argument could make a weaker claim. Putting life on Mars would still protect it from disaster in the short term, for instance, asteroid impact, supervolcano, some terrible plague or whatever. We could treat Mars almost like an ark, retaining life just in case something happens on Earth. This doesn't seem very plausible though, simply because things like such events would never destroy all life. Remember, life has been around for billions of years, and even in the worst extinction events, there was still plenty of diversity among life. Life has never been reset to microbes. There have always been plants and even animals, since they evolved. Indeed, freak events like this are unlikely to destroy even all humans. Humans survived a supervolcano eruption before, the Toba super eruption, which caused human numbers to dwindle to about 10,000. We still pulled through. There are events that could totally sterilise the Earth. For instance, a gamma ray burst directed at this planet from a star relatively close to us. That would wipe out all life. The problem is that this would totally sterilise Mars as well. So the protection of life argument, whether it's in terms of survival into the future or in terms of protection from disastrous events, seems maybe quite weak. Nevertheless, I think we have here a very strong in-principle argument for terraforming. The survival needs of life clearly outweigh whatever value untouched abiotic landscapes have. If we could figure out a way to terraform that would last billions rather than millions of years, clearly we should do it. Clearly it would be, I think it would clearly be good to, it would clearly be acceptable to extend the survival of life. The survival of life is an extremely important thing, and it's acceptable, it seems to me, to use other planets for that purpose. The point raised about the loss of habitable conditions on Mars leads straight to another possible defence of terraforming. Environmental restoration, which involves trying to return an environment to an earlier, more valuable state, is clearly justifiable in many circumstances. It's obviously acceptable. It's probably obligatory in cases where humans have damaged an environment. If a company cuts down a load of trees on an island and strip mines the island, we might say they have an obligation to restore it. Put the sand back, put the earth back, plant more trees. But it's also acceptable in response to natural disasters. If the island has been terribly damaged by a hurricane, it might not be obligatory, but it would surely be acceptable to restore it. Perhaps. That seems plausible to me. As we've seen, our best evidence suggests that Mars once had conditions capable of supporting life. So why not approach terraforming as a kind of restoration? We simply restore Mars to this previous state and make it so that it's capable of supporting life again. I mean, as we pointed out earlier, not all natural events are good ones. If Mars was once capable of supporting life but now isn't, that would seem to be a change for the worse. This would suggest that it's acceptable to restore Mars's environment to a previous state. And then having done that, why not introduce life? There are, of course, limits on restoration. We have to accept that nature changes, and there's a danger of restoration being used as a way to cling to the past, as it were. I mean, suppose we could restore the Earth to the sort of conditions it had in the Carboniferous period. Obviously that would be silly. The Carboniferous period is over. Move on. Would terraforming Mars evince this kind of attitude, this desire to force nature to be static and never change? I don't see why it would. I mean, restoring Mars to conditions it had billions of years ago wouldn't be quite the same as doing that on Earth, simply because the Earth changes much more rapidly than Mars does. So I think this kind of appeal to restoration is perfectly legitimate. I mean, the point is, in the case of the Earth, billions of years ago, it's changed an enormous amount since then, whereas Mars simply had habitable conditions which it has lost, and it's been basically static ever since. Third, we could think of terraforming as a kind of compensation for damage done to earthbound life. Humans are currently perpetrating a mass extinction event. I mean that literally. There have been 5 big mass extinctions in the past. The biggest was the Permian-Triassic extinction event. The most famous was the Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction event, which wiped out the dinosaurs. Although actually it didn't, because all birds are dinosaurs. They're theropod dinosaurs, to be exact. I don't mean they're a bit like dinosaurs. They're literally dinosaurs. They're a member of the clade Dinosauria. But a lot of dinosaurs were wiped out at the end of the Cretaceous. There is a 6th extinction going on now. It's called the Holocene extinction event, and humans are almost entirely responsible for it. It's by far the most severe extinction event in this planet's history. The current rate of species extinction is about 10 to 100 times higher than in any of the past mass extinctions. So it's pretty serious stuff. With this in mind, we might think that bringing life to Mars represents a kind of compensation, a way of making up for these these wrongs. My own feeling is that terraforming can be acceptable. Although terraforming will degrade some value, it could also produce great value. I mean, that's kind of a consequentialist way of looking at it, but I do think that I think there are good reasons we might want to terraform. Nevertheless, I don't think other planets are simply ours to do with as we will. Terraforming, if it ever happens, should be restricted. So, let's consider some plausible restrictions. Holmes Rolston III has an interesting article called The Preservation of Natural Value in the Solar System, which doesn't deal with terraforming specifically, but he articulates 6 injunctions in our behaviour towards objects in the solar system, which obviously would apply to terraforming. 3 in particular are important. The other 3 I don't think work, but you can read his article, it's online. I don't buy the other 3, but these 3 seem good ones to me. First, we must respect exotic extremes. There should be greater pressure to preserve the unusual, the bizarre, striking things. Consider the rings of Saturn, the ice volcanoes of Titan, or the extreme volcanic activity on Io. Even if we could terraform Io, we probably shouldn't, simply because it's so strange. It's such a bizarre kind of object. It's extremely geologically active, the most geologically active place in the solar system. Second, respect places of historical value. This could be a matter of places that are of historical value for humans. For instance, the landing site of the Apollo 11 mission. That's a cultural artifact of enormous importance. It would obviously be wrong to destroy it. But as Rolston puts it, we can also think of nature as telling stories. Some places in the solar system will have a more active history or a more notable historical record than others. So think of impact craters. Impact craters record the history of a planet, and we might think that some craters are of particular value. We might find an especially old or an especially large impact crater. This could be a place of historical value. Respect places of aesthetic value. That's fairly self-explanatory, I think, fairly straightforward. I would add 3 more injunctions to these. Fourth, respect any planet that already has extraterrestrial life. I think this is pretty obvious. If there is extraterrestrial life, that would be an incredible discovery, and we would need enormously good reasons to degrade or destroy it for our own ends. We could take this as a general injunction against any kind of terraforming on that planet, or we might say that terraforming is acceptable even in this case, but that it would have to be done with a view to allowing the extraterrestrial life to develop on its own terms. This is the view of Christopher McKay, who we mentioned earlier. He thinks that if we were to find life on Mars, it should be forbidden to make Mars like Earth. Don't degrade the current Martian life for our sake. But it would be totally acceptable, indeed he thinks it would be very good, to alter the Martian climate so as to encourage that life to spread. We should help Mars develop its own robust biosphere. And this view seems perfectly plausible to me. The point is, don't degrade or destroy the Martians, let them keep their planet for themselves. Fifth, perhaps this is related to the first point, but it's worth stating explicitly, we should value diversity in the solar system. Not every planet should be suitable for life. There should be some barren, lifeless worlds, just because they contribute to the diversity and richness of the solar system as a whole. It's just like how on our own planet we value a diversity of ecosystems. Both fertile rainforests and barren deserts each add to the beauty and richness of the whole. If there were no deserts at all, the world would be worse off. Sixth, perhaps we should say that the goal should not be making the planet habitable for humans, but making the planet habitable for life. I think that this deals with the concerns that have been raised about terraforming. If it's simply a matter of spreading life beyond the Earth, I really don't see why there would be anything necessarily wrong with that. It certainly wouldn't evince any misplaced sense of human superiority or whatever. It's not really important whether you agree with these 6 constraints. The larger point is that I think terraforming can be permissible in principle. But the arguments that have been raised do bring up some important issues. If we ever do expand across the solar system, we shouldn't treat the environments we find there as simply ours to do whatever we want with. They're worthy of consideration for what they are in themselves. Terraforming would therefore need to be constrained. Those 6 points are just a first suggestion at the kinds of constraints I think would be appropriate. But that's about it for now. That was terraforming and the ethics of it. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.